Ava and I, twin sisters, born on the same day, at the same hour, with the same first cry. But from as early as I could remember, I understood that not all twins are loved equally. Ava was always called the pride, while I was the defective prototype. 3 years ago, our parents gave her $100,000 to start a business, threw a huge party, and celebrated as if their future had just been permanently secured. And me? They left me with one line. "You never finish anything." I didn't argue. I just stayed silent, cut off contact, deleted the family group chat 3 clean years, like a detox for the soul. Then yesterday, Ava drove past my eco farm, called our dad in a panic, saying, "Dad, you need to see this." And what happened next, they will never forget. If you've ever been treated like you didn't matter in your own home, stay. This is my story. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment so I know I'm not alone on this journey. I was born in Eugene, Oregon, a small town where spring smells like damp soil and the sound of rain on the roof feels like a lullaby that never ends. My family lived in a 2-story cream-colored house at the end of a street lined with red maple trees every fall. From the outside, anyone would think we were the perfect American family, happy, polished, 2 pretty twin daughters who could have been on the cover of a family magazine. But behind those neatly framed photos on the wall, I was always the one cropped out, sometimes because I stood in the wrong light, sometimes simply because no one ever called me to stand closer. My father, David Reed, was a software engineer at a local tech company. He lived by rules, by logic, and worshipped success measured in numbers, money, and visible results. My mother, Linda, was an accountant, someone who calculated every figure, every bill, and every expectation she had for her 2 daughters. They gave birth to twin girls but raised us as if we belonged to 2 entirely different worlds that never touched. Ava, my twin sister, was the pride of the family. She was lively, quick-witted, always knew exactly what to say to please the adults. Ava spoke with confidence, walked like she was made for the spotlight, and my father always looked at her as if she were the younger, more perfect reflection of himself. I was different. Quiet, observant, the kind of child who could sit in the backyard for hours watching insects, sketching the shapes of branches, trying to memorize how the light shifted as the sun crossed the sky. I loved computers, loved creating things no one else thought of, but that was never enough to earn praise. To my father, art was a vague thing that doesn't generate profit, and nature was just something people photograph and then forget. My mother often said, "You should be more like Ava, more active, more practical. The world will crush people like you." I would just smile faintly because I had long understood that in this house, I didn't need to compete for a place. I just needed to exist without causing any more disappointment. I still remember our 8th birthday. Dad bought Ava a brand new Lego robotics kit, big box, full of shiny parts and manuals. He said, "This is for you to learn how to build things, so you can understand logic." When I opened my gift, inside was an old watercolor set, the box slightly chipped at the corner. Mom said, "You like to paint, don't you? This suits you better." Dad spent the evening teaching Ava how to assemble her robot. I was told to clear the dinner table afterward. Back then, I didn't feel hurt, just a faint sadness, like the first drizzle of spring. But as I grew older, I realized it wasn't an accident, it was a system. A system where Ava was invested in, and I was reminded to be content with what you have. When we were in 6th grade, Ava joined the school's coding club and quickly became a little star. She won a medal in a state-level programming competition. Dad called everyone he knew, recounting every detail with glowing pride in his eyes. I also entered a school-wide poster design contest about environmental protection and won 1st place. When I brought the certificate home, Dad barely glanced at it, set it down on the table, and said, "Paintings don't feed anyone, Lena. You should think bigger." I nodded, pretending to agree, but deep down, I could feel myself slowly being erased. I grew up surrounded by constant, subtle comparisons, like tiny cuts that never bled but always stung. When Ava was praised as talented, with a bright future, I was told to be realistic, stop dreaming. When Dad taught Ava how to code, I was told to sweep the garage. When Ava was allowed to attend a tech summer camp in Seattle, I had to stay home and tend the garden because someone needs to help mom. I used to wonder if I'd done something wrong, or if it was simply because I wasn't like him, not the kind of person he believed could ever succeed. Every night, I'd sit on the porch, looking through the living room window, where Dad and Ava laughed over a line of code that finally worked. The glow from the monitor reflected across their faces, and for a moment, they looked almost identical. Meanwhile, I sat quietly in the dark, sketchbook in hand, drawing that exact scene as if it were the only way to preserve my place in a family that never really saw me. Those years taught me one truth. Love that must be fought for is no longer love. And when a child is weighed on a scale of comparison all through their childhood, they learn to stay silent not because they are weak, but because they know that no explanation can change the mind of someone who only hears what they want to believe. I was still Lena, the quiet girl with the old watercolor set. But deep inside, I had already begun painting a world of my own, one where I didn't need permission to stand in the light. When I entered college, the path between Ava and me finally split for good. She chose the University of Washington, a prestigious school in Seattle, while I went for Portland State, a more practical choice that matched the student loan I could afford on my own. But in my parents' eyes, that difference was enough to define our worth. Ava was the pride, and I was the one who sold her future short. They hugged her tightly the day she got her acceptance letter, threw a party, invited relatives and neighbors. When I told them I'd been accepted to Portland, Dad simply said, "At least you didn't get rejected." I smiled, because I was used to it. In our family, everything I did was always measured against one scale: Ava's. On move-in day, I watched Ava climb into the brand new SUV Dad had just bought her. She waved, the trunk filled with a MacBook Pro, new clothes, and enough living allowance to cover the semester. I loaded my worn-out backpack and old suitcase onto a long-distance bus, carrying a used laptop I'd bought off Craigslist. No send-off party, no hug, just Mom reminding me, "Don't waste money. Ava knows how to manage hers." I simply said, "I know," and the door closed behind me so softly that no one even noticed. Portland, for me, was a city of endless rain, coffee-scented mornings, and long nights lit by study lamps. I rented a small room near campus, the ceiling so low that I had to duck every time I stretched. By day, I studied environmental architecture, how to design green spaces, recycle energy, and restore damaged soil. By night, I worked as a barista at a cafe near campus, wiping tables, pouring espresso, smiling at customers even when my hands smelled of detergent. Some nights, I stayed up late designing logos for small local shops, my eyes burning from the screen light. Ava was different. Every time she posted a photo online, I saw her sitting in her bright apartment, a desk full of flowers beside the brand new computer Dad had bought her. Mom always commented underneath, "So proud of you, sweetheart." Under my posts there was only silence. I wasn't jealous, but I could feel the distance between us stretching wider, like two branches growing in opposite directions. By the middle of sophomore year, my body began to fight back. That winter was cold and damp, and I had been working back-to-back night shifts. By the time I got home, I was exhausted, coughing so hard I could barely breathe. I tried to push through it, drank warm water, thinking it was just the flu. But one morning, I collapsed right outside my dorm. When I woke up, I was in the student health clinic, throat burning, hands shaking too much to hold my phone. I called my mother. Her voice came through sharp and distant, like a news broadcast. "Don't be weak. Ava never missed a single day of class." I stayed silent. She asked, "Is there anyone helping you?" I said quietly, "No need, Mom." The call ended with a cold, mechanical beep. That night, the person who came to check on me wasn't my mother, it was my advisor, Professor Patrick Lowen. He was in his 60s, with silver hair and hands that always smelled faintly of soil because he taught ecological restoration. He brought a paper bag with medicine, a bowl of hot soup, and a small note. "I heard from the students that you weren't feeling well," he said softly. "Here's the medicine, and this," he placed $200 on the table, "is so you can take a few days off work." You're not a machine, Lena. You need to learn to accept kindness, not just endure. How no? I broke down crying the moment he left. Not because of the money, but because it was the first time in years someone had truly seen me, not to compare, not to judge, but simply to care. I used that money to pay my electricity bill and buy some groceries. Each time I ate the soup, I thought of Professor Lowen's eyes, the kind of eyes a real father would have, one I never did. He didn't ask why I worked so many jobs, didn't tell me to try harder, he simply said, "You deserve to rest." Those words were as light as a breath, yet strong enough to carry me through that entire winter. After I recovered, I began spending more time in Professor Lowen's lab. He gave me extra reading materials about soil restoration projects across Oregon, about how technology could help automate irrigation systems, and he always encouraged me to take notes on any ideas that came to mind. Once, when I admitted that I was unsure about continuing my studies because of money, he said, "You don't need anyone's approval to keep learning. Education is a journey you authorize for yourself." That's how my college years went, quietly, but with a small light guiding the way. I didn't have parents beside me, but I had strangers who taught me how to believe in kindness again. And over time, I realized that sometimes what we need isn't a perfect family, but someone willing to stop along the road and say, "You've come a long way, don't forget to breathe." I don't remember exactly when I stopped hoping my parents would call. Maybe it was the day I could turn off my phone without feeling guilty. All I know is that from that moment on, my world began to open, not through praise, but through the freedom of no longer needing to prove my worth to anyone. That spring, Ava and I both graduated. Two sisters born on the same day, both wearing caps and gowns, holding diplomas in our hands, yet walking paths so different it was almost unbelievable. Ava graduated with a startup project in AI for e-commerce, which my father proudly called the future of intelligent retail. As for me, I had only a blueprint for an automated urban farming system, an idea born from countless nights sketching in a damp apartment, where the window leaked cold air and the sound of city buses echoed through thin walls. My parents drove nearly 3 hours to Seattle to attend Ava's product launch. They even rented a conference room at the Marriott, hung a banner that read, "Ava Reed Technologies, Launch Demo." I saw the photos they posted online, mom in a navy blue dress, dad wearing a perfectly knotted tie, both smiling brightly as they cut a cake that said, "To the future CEO." All the relatives, friends, and dad's colleagues were there. Underneath the post were dozens of congratulatory comments. Meanwhile, I stood in a small university lab, presenting my project, Smart Urban Garden System, to a panel of 4 professors. No one from my family came. I no longer expected them to. I still remember my hands trembling slightly as I clicked through the slides, explaining the drip irrigation model integrated with light sensors, my voice raspy from a lingering sore throat. When Professor Lowen asked, "If you had more funding, how would you expand this?" I answered, "I want to create spaces that can heal themselves just like people do." The panel went silent for a few seconds before one professor smiled. I knew I had done well. But when the defense ended, other students were greeted by families holding flowers, hugs, and cameras. I only had my folder of documents and a completion form. I walked out of the building into the Portland rain, the wind biting softly against my face, and that was the only graduation ceremony I ever had. That night, I took a 3.5-hour bus ride home. The streetlights smeared across the fogged-up window, reflecting my own faint silhouette, a freshly graduated woman who felt strangely hollow inside. When I stepped into the house, Dad was sitting on the couch, laptop on his knees, the screen's glow lighting up his proud face. Mom was making coffee, talking on the phone with someone about Ava's initial investment. When they saw me, the moment paused only long enough for a few indifferent greetings. Dad didn't even look up as he said, "Ava has a plan. You just have ideas." I set my backpack down, forcing my voice to stay calm. "Ideas are where plans begin," I said. He raised an eyebrow, his tone cold. "Not for people who don't know how to execute them." Mom walked over, placed her cup down, her voice softer but no warmer. "You have to be realistic, Lena. Art, design, environmental stuff, it all sounds nice, but it won't pay the bills. I looked at them, two people who believed they knew me better than anyone, and felt an exhaustion that had nothing to do with the long bus ride. It wasn't their criticism that hurt anymore. It was realizing they'd never once tried to listen to what I truly wanted. Ava came down the stairs, her hair neatly tied up, wearing a crisp white blouse, looking like a perfect mirror of our father. She smiled at me and said, "They just want what's best for you. They see your potential, it's just different from theirs." I looked at her, part of me wanting to believe it, but the rest knowing better. In this house, every kind word was always wrapped in sugar, coded concern for your own good. But sugar, left too long, turns to poison. After dinner, Dad opened his laptop and started showing Mom a slide deck outlining Ava's startup expansion plan. I sat quietly at the end of the table, eating the pasta Mom had made. Then he turned to me and asked, "So, what are your plans now?" I said, "I'll stay in Portland and look for something in ecological design." He chuckled, unable to hide the sarcasm. "Better find a real job, not one of those drawing hobbies." Mom added softly, as if commenting on the weather, "Your father's right. Maybe you should put that dream on hold for a while." I set my fork down, looked at both of them, then at Ava, who couldn't meet my eyes. I spoke slowly, each word carving itself into me. "Maybe I just need to learn how to feed myself." Mom hesitated for a moment, but Dad only waved his hand dismissively, like a man tired of a child talking back. I stood up, carried my plate to the sink, and washed each dish under cold water, letting the sound of the running tap drown out their conversation behind me. My parents decided to host a dinner at an Italian restaurant in downtown Eugene. I sat at the far end of the long table, where the chandelier's light only reached half my face, the other half hidden in shadow. It was supposed to be a graduation celebration for both daughters, as Mom had said over the phone. But the moment I walked in, I knew. The night wasn't for me. It was built to celebrate Ava, the daughter with vision, with direction, the one worthy of pride. My father had chosen the longest table in the restaurant. He was already seated there, adjusting his tie, while my mother beamed beside him, holding the menu as if she were signing a major deal. Ava arrived a few minutes late, wearing an ivory dress, her hair tied low, her face glowing with quiet confidence. I was the last to arrive, wrapped in a dark cardigan against the wind outside. When I sat down, Mom leaned toward me and whispered, "You should take off your sweater, so the family photos look nicer." I replied softly, "That's not necessary, Mom." Alder. Dinner began with a chorus of laughter and animated voices. Mom told everyone about Ava's product launch. She presented like a real CEO. Everyone was so impressed, she said. Dad chuckled proudly. "That girl has a business mind, she can see the bigger picture. We're planning to fund her first investment round." I stayed silent, cutting through a piece of hard bread, chewing slowly. My mind drifted to all those nights when Ava went to bed early, and I stayed up sketching until dawn the projects I never had the chance to present. When the main course arrived, Dad set his wine glass down, his voice firm and deliberate, as if addressing a board meeting. "We've decided to invest $100,000 in Ava to launch her startup. She has vision, strategy, and the potential to build something meaningful." The table erupted in applause. I looked around, the pride shimmering in Mom's eyes, Ava bowing her head slightly, her soft smile both graceful and distant. A few seconds of silence followed. I set my knife down and asked quietly, "And what about me?" The question fell between us like a breath barely audible, yet heavy enough to freeze the air. Dad looked up, calm and detached, as if he'd been expecting it. "You never finish anything, Lena," he said slowly. "You're a risk. No one invests in someone who doesn't follow through." I heard every word clearly, each one like a blade sliding over skin not deep enough to wound, but sharp enough to make something inside me bleed. My mother cut in, her voice gentle, as if soothing a child who had just been scolded. "Lena, don't misunderstand. It's not that we don't care, we just can't invest in failure. But I believe you'll find your own path someday." She smiled faintly, placed her hand on her wine glass, and swirled it slowly, as though she had just said something kind. I looked down at my hands, the fingers stained with paint, dry and rough after months of working in the lab. I wanted to say, I'm not a failure, that I was simply different, but my throat tightened. The air around us was thick, heavy with the smell of tomato sauce and their self-importance. Ava said nothing. She just lowered her head, cutting her food with slow, careful motions, as if afraid that any sudden movement might disturb the still water. I caught her gaze for a brief second. There was pity in it, faint and fleeting, gone before it could mean anything. No defense, no disagreement. In that moment, I understood. In this family, silence was the common language of those who stood closest to power. My wine glass trembled slightly in my hand. I set it down, accidentally spilling a long, dark streak across the white tablecloth. Mom gasped, grabbing a napkin. "Oh my God, how clumsy of you." I watched the wine spreading slowly, bleeding into the fabric like an open wound. For the first time, I didn't rush to wipe it away. I just stared at it, letting the moment burn into memory, the instant when truth finally spilled out, impossible to contain, impossible to pretend away. I took a deep breath and said, my voice so calm it startled even me. "Then don't invest, I'll build it myself." The words came out soft, almost like an invitation, but they felt like an ending. Dad froze for a second, disbelief flashing into anger in his eyes. Mom reached out to touch his arm, signaling him to stay composed. I stood up, pushed my chair back, the scrape of the legs against the floor sounded like it tore through the air. Ava called out softly, "Lena." But I didn't turn around. I walked outside. The air was cold, carrying the damp scent of oncoming rain. The restaurant lights reflected off the wet pavement, stretching into long streaks of gold like the road I was about to take. Behind me, I could still hear their laughter through the glass, the sound of forks and glasses clinking, as if no one had just walked away from the table. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I knew one thing: I couldn't go back. When I reached the parking lot, I stopped and looked through the window one last time. Inside, my father was laughing with the waiter. My mother raised her glass in a toast, and Ava bowed her head politely as they spoke about the future. I stood there, watching, and realized I hadn't just left a dinner, I had left a family. Not out of anger, but clarity. The red wine stain on the white tablecloth was still there, and I knew they'd try to scrub it clean. But I wouldn't. I would leave it as it was, the first mark of my decision to stop cleaning up what was never meant to be mine. 2 days after that dinner, I left Eugene without saying goodbye. I only left a small note on the table. "Don't worry, I'm fine." Then I deleted the family group chat, changed my number, and shut down my social media accounts. What I felt first wasn't fear or regret, it was quiet. A strange, deep quiet, like stepping out of a room that's been too loud for too long and suddenly realizing you can still hear your own heartbeat. I drove to Bend, Oregon, a small town tucked between valleys and snow-capped mountains. A place where no one knew I was the other child, the one who was never chosen. I rented an old wooden cabin with a backyard and the faint sound of a river flowing somewhere in the distance. I found a job at a sustainable design firm, a small team that specialized in building eco-friendly housing. The pay wasn't great, but I got to touch the soil, to design spaces that could nurture both people and plants. No one there asked where I went to school or who invested in me. They only asked, "Are you willing to learn?" And I did, learning not just about design, but also how to plant trees, treat wastewater, and program automated drip irrigation systems. I began to love the work because it taught me something profound. Everything can be restored as long as you give it time and patience. At first, I still carried my old habits, the need to be perfect, to prove I was worthy. Every time my boss praised me, my heart tightened, as if waiting for someone else to overhear it. Every time I made a mistake, I immediately felt the sting of guilt, hearing my father's voice echoing in my mind. "See? You never finish anything." The weight of that voice was exhausting. One day, I decided to see a therapist named Dr. Harlow. Her office was inside a small white house with windows facing a lavender garden. She didn't ask many questions about my parents. She just listened, eyes a soft gray blue, calm, not cold. I told her about that dinner, about the red wine stain, about the years I'd spent trying to be seen, and about how silence sometimes hurt more than being yelled at. When my voice finally broke, she said something I've never forgotten. "Silence isn't punishment, Lena. It's how you breathe." I looked at her, confused. "But sometimes silence makes me feel like I'm disappearing." She smiled gently. "No, you're still there. You're just learning how to exist without asking for permission anymore." My first therapy session ended in tears, but the kind that soothed rather than stung. I began keeping a journal every night, writing down small moments that made me feel alive. Morning coffee on the porch. The sound of workers laughing under the midday sunday, the smell of damp earth after rain. I realized that happiness doesn't need to be acknowledged by anyone, it only needs permission, and that permission has to come from within. That winter, Bend was blanketed in snow. Christmas came without a single message from my family, no gifts except for a small card from my office that read, "Thank you for bringing warmth to the workplace." I didn't feel sad. I bought flour, eggs, and sugar, and baked cookies in my tiny kitchen. As the scent of vanilla filled the air, I opened my laptop and began writing emails to the people who had helped me along the way. One to Professor Lowen, who once gave me $200 and taught me the meaning of kindness. One to Dr. Harlow, who helped me realize that silence can also be a language. And one to myself, the person who had survived all the other silences. I remember sitting there, typing a few simple lines. "Thank you for being there when I had no one left to call. I'm okay. And I'm learning how to stay with myself." When I hit send, it felt like something inside my chest finally unlocked. Outside, snow was still falling softly. The oven light reflected off the window pane, turning the little house into a lone warm glow in the neighborhood. I realized then this was something my parents would never understand. That I didn't need them to feel whole. All I needed was a quiet space to breathe, to plant myself again like an old seed patiently waiting for the soil to warm. From that day on, whenever someone asked about my family, I didn't avoid the question anymore. I simply said, "They're somewhere out there, but I'm learning to be here." I planted a few small pots by the porch, installed a watering sensor I built myself, and named them the Second Start. Every morning, I checked the soil's moisture, inhaled the smell of freshly cut grass, and smiled at the sound of dripping water. It was the sound of life, not the noise of recognition, but the steady rhythm of something quietly growing, slow and steady. I didn't know if I was successful yet, but for the first time, I felt free. No one watching over me, no judging eyes, just me and a world coming back to life. And perhaps, in that silence, I finally began to hear my own voice. 2 years after leaving Eugene, I bought a piece of abandoned land on the outskirts of Sisters, Oregon, 15 acres of overgrown weeds reaching up to my knees, dotted with broken fences and rusted iron posts. The real estate agent called it a piece of land nobody wants. It used to be a farm, but after nearly a decade of neglect, the soil had turned infertile and the groundwater was tainted with iron. No one could make anything grow there. But as I stood in the middle of that windswept field, I felt an odd sense of peace. It wasn't perfect, but it was empty enough to begin again, just like me. I signed the contract right there, paying most of it with my small savings and the rest with a mortgage loan. When I held the keys in my hand, I knew I hadn't just bought land, I had bought a chance to create something that was finally, entirely mine. I named the project RootSync, a blend of root and sync. I wanted to build an AI, integrated ecological farming system where sensors and data could help people relearn the language of the earth. The idea came from everything I'd learned in Bend, a bridge between technology and biology, between machinery and nature. RootSync wouldn't just be a farm, it would be a self-learning model where machines analyze moisture, light, and pH levels, and humans learn to observe, adapt, and practice patience. But in the beginning, everything almost fell apart. I bought a batch of old, discounted sensors online and installed them across the field. 3 days later, the data started conflicting. One sensor read 85% humidity, another said 12. Rain poured down, the soil turned to mud, and I sat in the middle of the field with my laptop soaked, watching lines of code flash red with errors. For the first time, my idea felt like a burden. Every morning, I opened my datasheet, manually correcting values, desperately trying to keep things from collapsing. Within 2 months, I had lost nearly $8,000, almost all my savings. Some nights, I lay in the converted shipping container I used as a temporary shelter, listening to the wind scrape across the roof, hearing my father's voice in my head. "You never finish anything." And oh. But every morning, I got back up, opened my laptop, and started reading through every line of documentation again. I realized that if I wanted RootSync to live, I couldn't just be a designer. I had to become an engineer, a coder, an observer, and a fixer all at once. I relearned Python, scoured online forums for agri-tech communities, asked strangers how to recalibrate sensors. Each time the system crashed, I stopped panicking. Instead, I treated it as the land and the machines teaching me something new. By the 6th month, I wrote the first calibration software for RootSync. The system finally started to stabilize data aligned, temperature and humidity updated consistently. When the first clean graph appeared on my screen, running smooth and steady, I laughed out loud, my hands still covered in mud. That was the moment I understood you don't always need someone to invest in you to succeed. Sometimes, you just have to stand in the rain long enough to stop being afraid of getting wet. I built a small greenhouse powered by solar panels and started growing cold-resistant greens. Slowly, the land began to breathe again, the cracks in the soil softened, and tiny sprouts began to rise. I installed a few cameras, monitoring every change, recording the Earth's quiet recovery. By spring, RootSync had become the first functioning pilot model in the region. I wrote a short post on a local tech forum, sharing my story of self-learning and experimentation, mostly just to thank those who had offered advice along the way. I never expected it to spread. 3 days later, my inbox flooded with messages. A small tech magazine in Oregon featured the story with the headline, "Young Woman's Eco-Startup Revives Dead Soil in Sisters." The title was simple, but when I saw my name printed there, I didn't feel proud. I felt relieved. No one called me the other daughter. No one called me a failure. They just called me founder. After that, invitations started coming in for local agriculture conferences. I stood on small stages, microphone in hand, looking down at faces of strangers who actually wanted to hear me. And I realized I wasn't afraid of my own voice anymore. I spoke about nights hiding from the rain inside a shipping container, about the urge to give up, about the first time a sensor finally worked, and about how success isn't always loud, it can be as quiet as a stable line of data on a glowing screen. RootSync slowly began gaining its first clients, small farms curious to try the technology. I helped them install the systems, fine-tune the software, and taught them how to read the data. Every time I saw a patch of barren soil come back to life, I couldn't help but think of myself once depleted and dry, but somehow, through patience and time, managing to sprout again. That night, as I sat by the container window, the wind carrying the scent of fresh earth, I thought of my father. If he ever saw that article, he'd probably call it luck. But to me, this wasn't luck. It was the result of every long night no one saw, every line of code no one read, every drop of sweat no one believed in. And in that moment, I realized I no longer needed anyone to validate my worth. All I needed was the soil where every failure could be buried and something new could begin to grow. A full year passed since I first pushed those sensors into the ground. What was once barren land had now become a fully functioning system. 3 farms in the region signed official contracts with me for installation and maintenance. The farmers I once called sir and ma'am now called me the little engineer. They didn't fully understand the software I wrote, but they trusted what they saw. Their soil was richer, their crops bloomed evenly, and harvest season no longer depended on chance. I still remember the day I watched the first stable data stream come through from all three fields, the curves of temperature, moisture, and soil nutrients flickering, then slowly sinking together like a piece of music I had composed. For the first time, I truly felt I was creating something that mattered. RootSync began to generate steady income. I still lived simply in my little wooden house in Bend, driving each morning to Sisters to check the systems, then returning by afternoon to work with the technical support team. I hired a few interns, then expanded by bringing in local high school students as part-time helpers. They came to the farm on weekends, at first just to clear debris and pull weeds. But when I started showing them how the sensors worked and how to read the data on the display board, their excitement grew. I created a small program called STEM in the field. Every afternoon, we gathered around a laptop in the greenhouse. I taught them the basics of coding, and they, in turn, taught me how to laugh and not take everything so seriously. One boy named Logan once asked me, "Miss, if dead soil can come back to life, do you think I can too?" I smiled and patted his head. The soil came back because someone believed in it. You will too. One early summer morning, while I was checking the irrigation system, two small trucks pulled up by the gate. A crew from a local TV station had arrived. They said they wanted to film a short feature about women in technology. The title they chose made me laugh. Women in Tech, Healing the Earth. They filmed me at work, captured the kids planting sensors, and asked about my journey from city life to this quiet place. I didn't mention my parents. I didn't talk about those dinners filled with judgment. I simply said I wasn't running away from anyone. I was just looking for a place to begin. When the feature aired, messages poured into my inbox. Friends from Portland sent congratulations, and even a few small investors reached out with partnership offers. But I chose to keep RootSync at a modest scale because I knew once I let others steer it, it would lose the soul I had built into it from the very beginning. RootSync's income eventually became enough for me to pay off the land loan. When the first financial report showed all green numbers, I printed it out and taped it to the wall of my old container, the same place where I had written my first line of code. After that, I decided to expand, purchasing 10 more adjoining acres from a family preparing to move out of state. I renamed the entire area Reed Ecofields. I moved my office from the container to a restored wooden cabin and hung a new sign with the updated logo, 3 intersecting circles symbolizing technology, humanity, and nature. Beneath the word RootSync, I carved a small line, barely visible unless you stood close. From failure to foundation. I still remember how it felt to plant that sign into the ground. The wind was strong, my hair whipped wildly, and dust clung to my sleeves. But inside me was an unfamiliar calm. I had heard the words, "You're a failure," so many times that they had once become an echo etched into my mind. Now, I was using that very word as my foundation. Failure was no longer a sentence, it was soil, and I was planting seeds in it. A few months later, the reporters returned, this time from a bigger paper in Portland. They wanted to write a feature-length article about my model, calling it "Where Artificial Intelligence Meets Human Intuition." During the interview, one of them asked, "What do you think made you successful?" I answered simply, "Maybe because I failed enough times to learn how to stand still." That line ended up printed in the article. After it was published, RootSync received even more partnership offers. But I didn't rush. I wanted the system to be truly solid before it grew any larger. On the last afternoon of summer, when the kids finished their final lesson before the break, they surprised me with a small gift, a wooden sign engraved with the words, "Miss Reed's Lab." They said, "So everyone knows this is where you help the earth and people grow together." I looked at their muddy faces, their messy hands and dirt-streaked clothes, and my eyes stung. Not from pride, but from the quiet realization that I had finally built a place where I didn't need to be better than anyone, didn't need anyone's approval, I just needed to be there. That evening, I walked around the fields as the sun dipped low. The rows of sensors blinked soft green lights, like tiny electronic fireflies. In the distance, the wind rippled through the grass, sounding like the sea. I thought of my parents, of Ava, of that long-ago dinner. No anger, no regret. Just the calm understanding that they were strangers who had pushed me out of one home, only so I could find another right here, among the trees and soil. In my project notebook, I wrote the final line of that year. Rootsync didn't just heal the land, it healed the person once called a failure. When I closed the notebook and looked up, the sign under the fading sunset read Ecofields glowed faintly, each letter whispering, "You built this." And for the first time in my life, I truly believed that was enough. That evening, I was inside the newly built greenhouse, adjusting a temperature sensor, when a silver SUV pulled up by the gate. I glanced through the glass and froze. A familiar figure stepped out, blonde hair tied up, white blouse crisp and neat. Ava. It had been 3 years since I'd last seen her. The sun was setting behind her, bathing her in pale gold light, but her voice, echoing across the fence, was sharp and unchanged. "Dad, you need to see this. It's Lena's place." I didn't know who else was on the line, but bits of her words drifted in the wind. "It's huge. There's a sign that says Rootsync HQ." She paused, scanning the land, her expression caught somewhere between curiosity and discomfort, as if she couldn't quite believe the barren field she once drove past had turned into a thriving green ecosystem. I stepped out and opened the gate. Ava froze when she saw me. We stood a few meters apart, an uneasy silence stretching between us. She spoke first. "Lena, you actually built this?" I answered simply, "Yes. Every inch of it. Every wire." She nodded, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite read, then stepped back toward her car, muttering, "Good for you." "Really?" But just before she got in, I heard her voice again, this time softer, carried by the wind. "Dad, we really need to talk." 3 hours later, my phone rang. The number flashing on the screen, Dad. I stared at it for a long time. I wasn't afraid anymore, just strangely hollow. I picked up. His voice was the same deep tone I remembered, but now it trembled slightly. "Is that your property?" he asked. I looked out at the fields, the rows of sensors blinking green in the dusk. "Yes," I said. "Bought, built, and coded by myself." Silence. I could hear his breathing slow, heavy, as if he was weighing every word. Then finally, "Maybe we can invest," he said, forcing his voice back into that old, confident calm. "Help you expand, bring in more capital, more connections." We could. I cut him off, not sharply, just calmly, with a steadiness that surprised even me. "You already invested in the other twin. Keep your pattern consistent." There was a pause. A long breath, then his voice dropped lower. "Lena, that's not fair." I smiled faintly, though he couldn't see it. "Fairness was never the family business, Dad." I hung up. Outside, the wind bent the lavender stems, carrying the scent of wet soil and new grass through the air. I stood there, phone still in hand, feeling an emptiness inside, but not the painful kind. Just stillness. Quiet. The next morning, a small delivery truck stopped at the gate. The mail carrier handed me a cream-colored envelope, the handwriting in the corner instantly recognizable, my mother's. I didn't open it right away. I placed it on the desk in the operations room and went back to work. By afternoon, when the sunlight spilled gold across the window, I finally opened it. Inside was a bank check for exactly $100,000, clipped to a small handwritten note. "We're proud now. Love, Mom." I stared at the note for a long time. The handwriting was neat and slightly slanted, the same script that used to fill my elementary school notebooks with the phrase, "Practice makes perfect." Back then, I believed she was right. But now I knew. Some things never become perfect, no matter how long you practice, like conditional love. I held the check, feeling the chill of the paper against my fingertips. Maybe to them, this was an apology, a late investment. But to me, it was just another reminder that they still didn't understand. It wasn't money I ever needed, I only ever needed them to be there. I walked outside toward the greenhouse. It was late summer, the clouds hung low, and the sunset drenched the land in bronze. I lifted the lid of the bioburner beside the house. The wind brushed gently through the irrigation lines, making a soft sound like breathing. I tore the check in half, then into quarters, then eighths. The thick paper ripped with a sound that felt like something breaking loose. I tossed each fragment into the fire. The flames caught quickly, glowing orange against my face. Then I dropped the handwritten note in two, watching it curl, blacken, and vanish into a fine trail of gray ash. The ashes settled at the bottom, mixing with the compost. I scooped a handful of soil, scattered it over the embers, and stirred lightly. As the traces of ash disappeared into the dirt, I whispered not quite a curse, not quite forgiveness. Now we're even. I stood there, my hands coated in soot, staring out across the field. The last light of day poured over the land, and the sensors blinked in soft green rhythm like a constellation of man-made fireflies. I couldn't help but think, with a faint, quiet irony, the very thing they once called a failure was now what created real value. That night, I sat in my small office, the warm yellow light from the desk lamp casting a soft glow on the RootSync logo on the wall. 3 intersecting circles, the faint word read resting quietly in the center. I opened my laptop and typed into my journal. They sent me the same amount they once gave Ava. But money can't buy back time or presence. I didn't burn it out of anger. I burned it to return what no longer belonged to me. I saved the file and shut the laptop. Outside, the night draped over the land like a soft blanket. I could hear the crickets in the grass, the steady flow of water through the irrigation pipes, the whisper of wind brushing against the metal roof. Everything moved precisely, rhythmically, needing no supervision. And I realized maybe I was the same. I had rewritten the software of my own life, a system that no longer depended on anyone else to function. In the vast stillness of this land, I felt as light as a first breath after a long storm. The next morning, Oregon was colder than usual. I was outside with the kids, testing the newly upgraded irrigation system, when the security camera flashed an alert. A worn-out sedan had stopped at the front gate. A man stepped out, his silhouette so familiar that my heart tightened before my mind could name him. My father. He was wearing a navy wool coat, his tie slightly askew, his face thinner, older than I remembered. I stood still for a long moment, my chest calm, not angry, not afraid, just the quiet steadiness that comes after too many years of silence. I walked toward him, stopping a few meters away, the electronic gate between us. He looked around slowly, as if trying to reconcile the woman before him with the daughter he had once called a risk. Finally, he spoke, his voice trembling. "Lena, we were wrong. You proved yourself." I looked at him for a long time. Behind me, the lavender fields were fading into a soft purple under the morning sunday. I spoke slowly, each word deliberate and steady. I didn't need to, I just needed peace. He swallowed hard, his eyes red. "We love you, you know that? We were just trying to push you. It was tough love." I shook my head gently. "Love isn't proof," I said. "It's presence. And you never showed up." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of damp soil and flowers. I saw him lower his head, his shoulders trembling slightly. Maybe he was crying, or maybe he was just cold. In that moment, I didn't feel triumphant, nor bitter. Only a quiet sadness, the kind you feel when looking at a winter tree, knowing it once had every chance to bloom, but chose not to. "Can we start over?" he asked softly, his voice barely audible against the wind. I met his eyes, not cold, but certain. "You can start," I said. "But I'll stay here." I stepped back and pressed the button on the control panel. The iron gate slid shut, the motor humming low and steady. Through the narrowing gap, I saw him standing there, arms hanging loosely at his sides, as if trying to hold on to something that no longer existed. When the gate closed completely, I turned away without looking back. The kids were still waiting by the irrigation field. Logan was holding the data tablet, grinning from ear to ear. "Miss, I think the new system's working perfectly." I smiled, walked over, and nodded. "Good job, Logan. Now let's test the sunlight sensor." "Arcom." He bent over the control board, focused and determined, not noticing the tear that slipped down my cheek, not from sorrow, but from the quiet, certain knowledge that everything was finally where it belonged. A world outside the gate. A world inside. Two lines, no longer crossing. And I knew, from that moment on, I would never have to walk through that gate again. A year later, Rootsync was named among the Forbes Local Impact Awards under the category Women Innovators in Sustainability. When the host announced, Lena Reed, founder of Rootsync and Reed Eco Fields. I walked onto the stage in a pale gray linen dress, my hands still faintly stained with soil no matter how much I had washed them. The audience rose to their feet, applauding. The stage lights hit my face so bright that I had to squint, and for a moment, I remembered that same blinding glow from my old laptop screen, the night the first line of Rootsync code ran successfully. The feeling was exactly the same, except this time, I wasn't trembling. After the ceremony, I stepped into the hallway, where people were chatting and shaking hands. Through the crowd, I saw Ava. She stood a few meters away, dressed in a black coat, her hair shorter now, her eyes fixed on me as if searching for a place to begin. When our eyes met, she smiled a small, trembling smile, more real than any I'd ever seen from her before. I nodded, saying nothing. And somehow, that was enough. Her tears fell before any words could. She walked closer and stopped at just the right distance. I saw the news, she said softly. You did what I couldn't. I smiled faintly. You did what you were meant to. We just had different paths. She nodded, pressing her lips together. Dad watches your interviews, she whispered. He records them. I didn't respond. Part of me wanted to turn away, but another part only felt a quiet compassion, not for them, but for her, the girl who had grown up under the same air of impossible expectations. She looked down, her voice trembling. I'm proud of you, Lena. I placed a hand gently on her shoulder and said, It's okay, Ava, we're both learning. Then I turned and walked away. Not to escape, just to continue moving forward. The next day, I returned to Sisters. Spring had just begun. In the fields, the lavender had started to bloom again, intertwined with rows of yellow daisies I had planted that year. The sunlight reflected softly off the freshly painted Rootsync HQ sign, where beneath the name was the familiar logo, 3 intersecting circles. I stood there for a long while, looking at it. Every curve, every letter felt like an old scar, now stitched back together with light. That afternoon, I hosted a small workshop for a new group of students. A few new faces joined, and some of the old ones, now college students, came back to help. I told them about Rootsync's journey, but I left out the parts with tears. I simply said, if the earth can heal after being abandoned, so can people. The kids listened, nodding quietly. Logan, now taller than me, raised his hand and asked, Miss, if someone calls me a failure, what should I do? I smiled and handed him a small trowel. Use their words as fertilizer, I said. Every plant needs a little of that to grow. As the sun began to set, I stayed behind alone. The horizon burned in shades of amber, washing the entire field in warm light. I held the hose and let the water flow over the rows of yellow daisies. The droplets caught the sunlight, sparkling like strands of glitter. I spoke quietly, almost to myself. My parents gave my sister $100,000 to start her future. I wrote an algorithm to replant myself. I keep the land, the peace, and my name, Lena Reed. The wind rose soft, carrying the scent of lavender mixed with sunlight. I closed my eyes, listening to the soil breathe beneath my feet, hearing the small, steady rhythms of life returning all around me. No anger, no fear, no need for anyone to validate my worth anymore. When I opened my eyes, the sky was fading into gold. A flock of birds swept across, carving a gentle arc above the fields. I smiled. Maybe that was a good sign that everything had finally found its place again. And as I walked through the rows of flowers, I knew. My life had truly begun right here, in the very place they once said I would fail. If they call you a failure, turn it into fertilizer for your dreams. The last rays of sunlight slid across the yellow daisies and reflected on my face, not the girl I once was, but a woman who had finally learned how to bloom in her own season, in her own way.